The flight crew returned to their rhythm. Smiles rehearsed, drinks pre-poured, routine resumed. But one thing had shifted, and not everyone realized it yet. Outside, still on the tarmac, a sleek black SUV had pulled to a stop near the service lane. The man inside wasn't part of the flight crew. He wasn't listed on any manifest, but he had a tablet in hand and a live feed playing. Cabin camera. Row 1A. Time-stamped. He watched Jason move. Watched how it was handled. Watched who looked away. Then he pressed one button. Back in the air, 5 minutes passed. Turbulence-free. Cabin lights dimmed. Drink carts clicked into motion. Jason's phone buzzed once. He stood up quietly and stepped into the galley to take the call. The curtain closed behind him. The man in 1A was already on his second scotch, laughing with someone over speakerphone about a merger. The kind of laugh people use when they know the world's been tilted in their favor since birth. Jason returned to his seat in silence. No one noticed, except the lead flight attendant, who suddenly looked down at her handheld and went pale. A message, bold red, urgent. Another came through. Then another. Something about passenger relations, internal review, priority escalation. She blinked, swallowed, walked fast toward the front, tapping on the cockpit door with quiet urgency. Jason leaned his head back against the rest. Didn't move, didn't smile, but something in the air had changed. The man in 1A raised his glass toward an assistant 2 rows back and said, "Some people just don't know their place." Jason didn't flinch. He'd heard louder men say worse. But it wasn't about what he heard anymore. It was about what came next. Because someone was watching, they told Jason Statham to move. From a seat he'd paid for, in front of everyone. The man behind him, loud, entitled, and dripping with fake charm, smirked as the flight crew sided with money over manners. Jason didn't argue. He just stood up and let it happen. But 5 minutes later, everything flipped. When you treat people like they're nothing, you better pray they stay nothing. Jason Statham was quiet. That was your first mistake. Before we continue, I'd love to know, where are you watching from today? Comment below. Jason Statham didn't belong to the noise. He never had. Not in boardrooms, not in back rooms, and definitely not on planes filled with people pretending to be important. He walked up the jet bridge slow, easy, dressed in a dark jacket, plain shirt, worn boots. No security, no entourage, no sign that he was anything more than a tired man catching a red eye. He handed the attendant his ticket, without a word. She barely looked at him before waving him through. Seat 1A. Window. Quiet. Perfect. The plane was a luxury charter. Flights reserved for corporate elites, legacy heirs, and the kind of people who treat the clouds like personal property. Jason had flown this route before. New York to L.A. 2.5 hours apiece if he kept his head down. He slipped into his seat. No champagne. No overhead talk. Just silence and the low hum of engines not yet roaring. Then the boarding music changed. It always did when someone loud came on. The man was tall, tan, and too polished to be real. Designer everything. The kind of laugh you only hear from people who've never worked a real job. 2 assistants followed him, both juggling iPads and schedules. He glanced at Jason, then frowned like someone had handed him the wrong drink. "Excuse me," the man said, already turning to a nearby flight attendant. "I specifically requested I not be seated next to anyone, especially not a—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Jason stayed seated, eyes out the window, the kind of calm that doesn't come from pride, but from something deeper. Older. The lead flight attendant, younger, nervous, leaned in close. "Mr. Statham," she whispered, "we've just had a seating conflict. There's been an oversight. Would you mind relocating to seat 4C in business? Just for this leg." Jason looked at her. She didn't meet his eyes. He nodded once. "Sure." He stood, grabbed his bag. No drama, no scene, but people noticed. 2 rows behind, a woman lowered her sunglasses and muttered, "Isn't that—" Her seatmate elbowed her quiet. The man took Jason's seat like he'd earned it, leaned back with a smirk. Finally, Jason made his way back through the cabin. The stares were subtle but present. Some were confused, some embarrassed. A few recorded, thumbs barely hidden behind tray tables. Seat 4C wasn't bad, but it wasn't 1A. He sat down slowly, closed his eyes, and for a moment just breathed. And Jason Statham was no longer just a passenger. Jason Statham didn't take many calls in public. That was part of the reason people underestimated him. But this call wasn't optional. He stepped into the galley with his phone still buzzing. Behind the curtain, out of sight, he answered with a quiet, steady, "Yeah." No greeting, no fluff. The voice on the other end was crisp, older, and full of apology, but not the panic kind, the respectful kind, the kind that knew who they were speaking to. "We saw it. Live feed flagged it. Responses already in motion. Just give us the word if you want to pull the trigger." Jason didn't answer right away. He looked at the espresso machine, humming quietly behind him, the perfectly folded napkins, the calm before the corporate storm. "Let it ride," he finally said. "Let's see how deep it goes." Then he ended the call. He pulled the curtain open and walked back to seat 4C, just as casually as before. No one noticed, except for the head flight attendant, whose handheld buzzed again the moment he sat. This time, it wasn't just an alert. It was a command. "Debrief all staff. Priority immediate. See cockpit." Her hands shook. She turned to the junior attendant behind her and whispered something that made her eyes go wide. Then she briskly walked toward the front. In the back, the assistants of the loud exec had started whispering to each other. Something didn't feel right. They'd seen power before, but this wasn't normal panic. This was preemptive damage control. In seat 1A, the man was still riding high. Another drink. Another boast about his latest acquisition. He gestured with his glass, loud and careless. "Hey," he called out to the aisle, "can someone remind me what I pay you people for? You're lucky to be on this flight." He laughed at his own joke. No one else did. The lead attendant came back 10 minutes later. Her smile was still there, but now it was cracked, like a mask losing its glue. She approached Jason quietly. "Mr. Statham," she said, voice barely a whisper, "we would like to offer you your original seat back, with our sincerest apologies." Jason didn't even look at her. "I'm good here," he said flatly. She stood there, unsure what to do next, waiting for a script that didn't exist. Then she nodded and walked away. A second later, the captain's voice came over the intercom, polite, professional, but shaking at the edges. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to inform you that upon arrival, our current cabin staff will be meeting with internal management for an important operational review. This will not affect the duration of your flight. We appreciate your understanding." Jason kept his eyes closed, but the air had shifted. Everyone felt it. The man in 1A laughed again, nervously this time. "You people are acting like you just saw a ghost." Jason turned his head slowly and looked him in the eye. "No ghost," he said. "Just someone who pays attention." That's when passengers really started whispering. Someone had Googled his name, confirmed it. Jason Statham wasn't just famous. He was listed as a silent equity partner in one of the parent firms that owned the airline. A silent partner. Until now, the bully exec started to squirm. He asked for another drink. The attendant told him they were out. He didn't like that answer. "You'll find one," he said sharply. But this time, she didn't move. She just looked at Jason, waiting. Jason didn't blink. In the cabin, phones were out again, but this time, people weren't filming the spectacle. They were documenting the shift, a moment where silence turned to consequence. The exec in 1A stood up, tried to assert control. "This is absurd. You think some actor can pull strings just because he's on a plane?" Jason spoke without looking. "Not strings. Leverage." The word landed like a stone. One of the assistants to the exec, young, quiet, fed up, finally stood too. "I think you should sit down," she said to her boss. "This isn't your flight anymore." She looked at Jason, not for approval, but for backup. And for the first time in a long time, she got it. Jason didn't say anything else. He didn't need to, because whatever was coming next had already begun. The name Jason Statham was now bouncing quietly through the cabin like a secret that got loose. One passenger whispered it behind a magazine. Another typed it into a group chat. Someone up front mouthed, "That's him." But the man in seat 1A still didn't get it. He thought this was about fame, recognition, Hollywood. He leaned back, gave a smug grin, and said, "So what? You're a movie star." "Big deal." Jason didn't even turn his head. Across the aisle, one of the assistants, the younger one, the one who'd stood up, was watching everything unfold with a kind of awe, like someone finally realizing they weren't alone. Meanwhile, the cabin crew was unraveling fast. The handheld devices kept buzzing. Some messages were silent. Some weren't. Ground response requested. Stand by for executive override. Prepare personnel for release upon arrival. Those weren't alerts. They were warnings. Back near the cockpit, the flight manager tried to hold it together. She kept checking her reflection in the lavatory mirror, adjusting her smile like it might save her job. The pilot came out briefly. He walked down the aisle, not to check the flight, but to check on Jason. He leaned down, whispered something respectful, and Jason gave him a slow nod. That was it. But when the pilot stood up and walked away, his shoulders were straighter, like a man who'd been cleared to do the right thing. The exec in 1A chuckled again. "I've seen this act before," he said, waving his hand like it was all a joke. "Some washed-up guy trying to play hero. You think because you've got a few shares in the airline you can scare me?" Jason finally turned. "Not here to scare you," he said evenly. "I'm here to give you a choice." The exec blinked. Jason stood slowly, walked forward, and stopped beside the man who'd taken his seat. "You apologize," Jason said. "Not to me, to them." He nodded toward the flight crew, then the assistants, then the quiet passengers watching from behind their phones. Every person you've ever tried to embarrass, belittle, or silence, one at a time. Say their names. Own what you did, right here, right now. The exec laughed, but his voice cracked. "You're not serious." Jason pulled out a phone. A simple recording app was already open. "You've got 30 seconds, he said, "or you lose more than a seat." The man didn't speak. "Not yet." He looked around, expecting someone to step in. No one did. Then something unexpected happened. The assistant, Kara, her name barely whispered minutes earlier, spoke. "You don't have to apologize," she said, stepping into the aisle. "We already saved everything." She held up her own phone. A folder was open. "Abuse! Do not delete." It had voice recordings, emails, photos. One clip played on speaker for just a second. "You're lucky I don't replace you with someone quieter." The exec froze. Other passengers gasped. And Kara wasn't done. "We've reported him before," she said, now speaking to the whole cabin. "But no one ever did anything. They said it wasn't enough, that he was too valuable." Jason's voice was low, but sharp. How valuable is he now? The exec's face was drained of color. Kara turned to Jason. "You don't have to do this for me." Jason shook his head. "Not doing it for you. I'm doing it so the next person like you doesn't have to wait for someone like me." That was the line that landed. And it didn't stop there. A second assistant stood. Then a passenger from row 5. A man from row 2. Stories started coming out. Brief, scattered, but all pointing the same way. The exec looked surrounded. But it wasn't fists. It was truth. When they landed, the flight crew wasn't the only team waiting on the tarmac. 2 black sedans pulled up beside the jet bridge. Not airline cars. Government plates. One agent stepped inside, asked for the man by name, handed him a folder. The exec's voice cracked. "What is this?" The agent replied flatly, "A pattern." Jason sat back down. The seat he was in didn't matter anymore. Because respect wasn't about where you sat. It was about who you stood up for. The jet hadn't even reached the gate when everything shifted. The exec in 1A was no longer leaning back with his legs crossed and his glass full. He was sitting up straight now, pale lips tight. Every now and then, his eyes flicked toward the front of the cabin, as if trying to calculate a way out. But there was no out. Jason Statham stood again, this time slower, not to move, not to fight, but to finish. He walked toward the man, stopped just shy of his seat, and held out the phone again. Screen still lit, audio app still recording. "This is your last chance," Jason said, voice low but steady. "No more lawyers. No PR teams. Just truth. Say it." The exec scoffed, but the sound caught in his throat. His voice dropped. "You think this fixes anything? You think this matters?" Jason didn't blink. "You know what matters?" he said, leaning just slightly closer. "The people you thought didn't." The man looked around. He saw Kara standing, calm and unshaken. He saw passengers filming, whispering. He saw the door to the cockpit open, the pilot watching from shadows. He saw the entire crew frozen, waiting for what came next. And then the phone fell from Jason's hand. Not dropped, just released, as if it no longer mattered. "You had a chance," Jason said quietly. "You wasted it." He turned and walked back to 4C. That should have been the end. But Kara wasn't done. She stepped forward, past where Jason had stood, past the fear she carried for 3 years. "You made me cry in bathrooms," she said, loud enough for the whole cabin to hear. "You told me I'd never be more than a note-taker. You erased my name from a patent I helped build." She held up her phone again. This time, not to record, but to show the screen. An open document. The original file. Her name listed beside his. "You didn't just bully me. You built a company off my back and called it yours." The exec opened his mouth, but she held up her hand. "Don't," she said. "You've said enough." Jason watched, still seated, still quiet, but his eyes held fire. One of the flight attendants began to cry. Silently. She'd clearly seen too many days like this. Then a man from business class stood up, middle-aged, worn face. He held out his phone too. "I had a daughter who worked at your company," he said. 3 months. Quit after 2. Said she'd never felt smaller. He didn't say anything else. He didn't have to. The exec put his head in his hands. That was the moment the cabin shifted from fear to truth. The flight crew stepped away from the aisles. Passengers helped them collect the trash. Someone even brought tissues for Kara. A kind of human order emerged, something unspoken but deeply felt, because the real turbulence hadn't come from the skies. It came from silence, and silence was finally over. Jason stood once more, not to confront, but to connect. He walked to the front, where Kara stood frozen by her own bravery. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a card. No logo, no name, just a number, one she'd recognize later. "You're not done," he said gently. "You're just getting started." Then he turned to the flight crew. "You did your job," he said. "Now do better." And with that, he sat back down. 5 minutes later, the wheels touched the ground, and none of them would ever fly the same again. That moment Kara stood up, that hit different. What's a time you finally said something you've been holding in for too long? Drop your moment below. We're listening. The plane taxied slowly across the tarmac, but inside, time felt frozen. Everyone was upright, silent, waiting for the moment to break wide open. When the cabin doors hissed open, no one rushed to stand. No elbows in the aisle. No bags yanked from overhead compartments. Just a strange, quiet crowd that had witnessed something bigger than travel. The exec in 1A was the first to be asked to disembark. But it wasn't the usual, "Thank you for flying with us." 2 uniformed men in gray suits stepped into plane, holding slim black folders. "Mr. Kessler?" one asked. The exec tried to chuckle. "Is this necessary?" Jason watched from his seat, face unreadable. The agent flipped open the folder and read off 3 names. Kara's was one of them. The other 2 belonged to former employees, now witnesses. The charges weren't criminal, yet, but the investigation was official. Corporate fraud, workplace retaliation, patent suppression. It wouldn't make the evening news, but it would make history. Kessler stood slowly. No protest. No arrogance left. Just a man finally realizing he wasn't untouchable. As he passed Jason, he tried one last time. "This is personal for you, isn't it?" Jason didn't look up. No, he said, it's bigger than that. And that's when the story shifted again. Because while everyone thought this was about a seat, about one man getting embarrassed and making a scene, it wasn't. Not even close. Jason walked off the plane last, by choice. Outside, waiting on the runway beside the plane staircase, was a woman in a gray blazer and a white lanyard. She greeted him like an old friend, then handed him a digital tablet. Full reports in, she said. This was the last flight. Jason nodded, flipped through the report. The screen showed flight logs, crew reports, internal memos, all flagged, all quietly gathered. For months, Jason had been flying incognito. Different names, different tickets. Watching, listening, not just for himself, but for something bigger. The airline's board had been investigating silent discrimination for over a year, but they couldn't prove it until someone got close enough to feel it firsthand. Jason had volunteered. He didn't need the money. He didn't need the credit. But he knew exactly what it felt like to be underestimated, written off, asked to move just for this leg. He knew what it felt like to be told you didn't belong by people who'd never earned their spot to begin with. This flight, this moment, was a final test. And the people who failed it were already being replaced. The woman in the blazer smiled. You want to be the face of this. Jason shook his head. I'm not the face. He turned and nodded toward Kara, who was still standing just off the ramp, eyes wide, phone in hand, overwhelmed by everything unfolding around her. She is... The woman raised an eyebrow. You sure? Jason didn't hesitate. People like her? They don't need spotlights. They need space. He handed back the tablet, took one slow breath, looked up at the clouds. You ever think about how many people sit in the wrong seat every day? He asked softly, and how nobody notices until it's too late? The woman didn't answer. She didn't have to. Jason turned and walked toward the terminal. No cameras, no flash, just footsteps. Inside, the boardroom was already waiting. Members of the airline's executive team had gathered around a long glass table. Screens glowed with data, names, infractions, patterns. Jason walked in like he didn't need permission, because he didn't. Your people failed, he said simply, not because of one mistake, but because it wasn't one. He tapped the screen. These aren't errors. They're habits. One board member cleared his throat. What do you recommend? Jason looked at them, quiet but firm. You rebuild your culture from the gate up. New training, new policy, and new people who actually see other people. Another board member tried to add, we can spin this, get ahead of the PR. Jason cut him off. You don't spin change. You be it. The room went still. Finally, the chairman nodded. You've got full control of internal operations. Pick your team. Rewrite it all. Jason nodded once. I already did. He slid a folder across the table. At the top was one name, Kara Lowell, and beneath it a title, Director of Passenger Advocacy and Staff Accountability. The headlines the next morning were quiet, but precise. Airline overhaul underway after anonymous partner uncovers systemic disrespect. Abuse allegations lead to executive dismissal. Industry-wide reform discussions begin. Jason Statham's name was never in the press release. That was by design. It wasn't about being seen. It was about making sure the right people finally were. The airline issued a formal apology, not to Jason, but to the staff and passengers who'd been quietly mistreated for years. Hidden policies were exposed. Vague VIP reassignments were abolished. A new code of dignity was installed across every crew, every shift. And Kara? She didn't go back to being an assistant. She stepped into a new office, bright, clean, and quiet, on the 42nd floor of the airline's headquarters. Her title was printed in gold on the door, but it wasn't the plaque that mattered. It was the open-door policy she posted on day one. Anyone, from janitor to junior flight attendant, could walk in and be heard. Her first move? A mentorship program, targeting young women in aviation and tech who'd been ignored, sidelined, or talked over. She called it the Runway Project. It took off faster than anyone expected. Back on the ground, Jason didn't slow down. He moved quietly through terminals and lobbies, eyes open. He still flew the same airline, but now when he boarded, the crew didn't greet him like a celebrity. They nodded like they knew, like they understood. One flight, weeks later, a new attendant leaned in as Jason buckled into a seat, row 3C, by choice. "Just wanted to say, thank you," she whispered. "We've heard what you did." Jason didn't smile. He just said, "Then make it count." Somewhere in the clouds between Denver and Chicago, a passenger in first class tried to throw his weight around, raised his voice, snapped his fingers for service. The crew didn't flinch. One of them calmly walked over and said, "We treat everyone the same here, sir. You're welcome to stay, so long as you do the same." The passenger backed down. Jason watched from his seat, said nothing, just turned toward the window and let the moment pass like a cloud drifting by. At the next layover, he stopped by the crew lounge. Quiet, respectful nods greeted him, not because of his fame, but because of what he stood for now. He found Kara sitting at a corner table, reviewing applications for her next round of hires. "You good?" he asked. She smiled. Not wide, just real. "I'm seen," she said. "That's enough." Jason nodded. "It's a start." They didn't talk long. They didn't need to. But as he turned to leave, she called out one more thing. "Hey, Jason." He looked back. "Thank you for giving up your seat." He paused. "No," he said. "Thank you for making it mean something. Respect isn't something you ask for. It's something you prove. In the quiet, in the moments no one else would notice." Jason Statham didn't make speeches. He didn't pull rank or raise his voice. He didn't need to. He let the system speak for itself. And when it did, when it exposed its cracks and showed its preference for power over people, he didn't patch it. He rebuilt it. Because sometimes the loudest thing you can do is stay seated when they try to move you. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stand when others can't. That day on the plane, Jason wasn't just removed from his seat. He was invited to see the truth up close. He watched how easily titles erase dignity, how fast someone could be silenced with a smirk, how often people like Kara were asked to shrink in the presence of people like Kessler. And in 5 minutes, the world changed, not because of a name or a title, but because someone chose not to stay silent. He didn't fight back with fists. He fought back with presence. Still, unshakable, steady as a mountain. And when the storm came, he didn't flinch. He let it crash around him, knowing that once the winds cleared, people would finally see what had always been there. Truth, accountability, a better way forward. You can buy a seat. You can even buy silence, but you can't buy honor. That has to be earned, moment by moment, choice by choice. Jason walked away from that flight without a single headline to his name, but he left behind a legacy in every gate, every crew briefing, every whisper between staff who now felt safer than they had in years. And the next time someone tries to humiliate a stranger in public, maybe they'll think twice, because you never know who's listening. You never know who's watching. And you never know when the quiet man in row 4 is there to change everything.